Hi, welcome back to to the 700th part of my Brave New World series, because this is quite a long read, but I'm only kidding. This is only part 4, but we are only on chapter 8. So I really did enjoy where we left off yesterday, because we got out of the world state area, and now we're in the savage reservations with Bernard and Lenina. And Bernard's Bernard's struggle is kind of coming into play between wanting to fit in so desperately and wanting to explore the parts of him that kind of make him unique from everybody else. It was nice to see his appreciation for what makes him different, because sometimes he can be insufferably insecure, but I won't hold it against him. Lenina is just really nice comic relief. So, but I'm curious to see how her character develops. And yeah, so I think let's get into it, shall we? I wonder if I can get past more than 2 chapters, but no promises here. Okay, so let's begin on chapter 8. Outside, in the dust and among the garbage, there were 4 dogs now. Bernard and John were walking slowly up and down. "So hard for me to realize," Bernard was saying, "to reconstruct, as though we were living on different planets in different centuries. A mother, and all this dirt, and gods, and old age, and disease." He shook his head. "It's almost inconceivable. I shall never understand unless you explain." "Explain what?" "This." He indicated the pueblo. "That." And it was the little house outside the village. "Everything, all your life." "But what is there to say?" "From the beginning, as far back as you can remember." "As far back as I can remember." John frowned. There was a long silence. It was very hot. They had eaten a lot of tortillas and sweet corn. Linda said, "Come and lie down, baby." They lay down together in the big bed. "Sing." And Linda sang. Sang Streptocock G to Banbury Tea, and "Bye, baby banting, soon you'll need decanting." Her voice got fainter and fainter. There was a loud noise, and he woke with a start. A man was standing by the bed, enormous, frightening. He was saying something to Linda, and Linda was laughing. She had pulled the blanket up to her chin, but the man pulled it down again. His hair was like 2 black ropes, and round his arm was a lovely silver bracelet with blue stones in it. He liked the bracelet, but all the same, he was frightened. He hid his face against Linda's body. Linda put her hand on him, and he felt safer. In those other words he did not understand so well, she said to the man, "Not with John here." The man looked at him, then again at Linda, and said a few words in a soft voice. Linda said, "No." But the man bent over the bed towards him, and his face was huge, terrible. The black ropes of hair touched the blanket. "No," Linda said again, and he felt her hand squeezing him more tightly. "No, no." But the man took hold of one of his arms, and it hurt. He screamed. The man put out his other hand and lifted him up. Linda was still holding him, still saying no, no. The man said something short and angry, and suddenly her hands were gone. "Linda, Linda." He kicked and wriggled, but the man carried him across to the door, opened it, put him down on the floor in the middle of the other room, and went away, shutting the door behind him. He got up, he ran to the door. Standing on tiptoe, he could just reach the big wooden latch. He lifted it and pushed, but the door wouldn't open. "Linda," he shouted. She didn't answer. He remembered a huge room, rather dark, and there were big wooden things with strings fastened to them, and lots of women standing round them, making blankets, Linda said. Linda told him to sit in the corner with the other children, while she went and helped the women. He played with the little boys for a long time. Suddenly, people started talking very loud, and there were the women pushing young Linda away, and Linda was crying. She went to the door, and he ran after her. He asked her why they were angry. "Because I broke something," she said. And then she got angry too. "How should I know how to do their beastly weaving?" she said. "Beastly savages." He asked her what savages were. When they got back to their house, Pope was waiting at the door, and he came in with them. He had a big gourd full of stuff that looked like water, only it wasn't water, but something with a bad smell that burnt your mouth and made you cough. Linda drank some, and Pope drank some, and then Linda laughed a lot and talked very loud, and then she and Pope went into the other room. When Pope went away, he went into the room. Linda was in bed and so fast asleep that he couldn't wake her. Pope used to come often. He said the stuff in the gourd was called mescal, but Linda said it ought to be called soma, only it made you feel ill afterwards. He hated Pope. He hated them all the men who came to see Linda. One afternoon, when he had been playing with the other children, it was cold, he remembered, and there was snow on the mountains. He came back to the house and heard angry voices in the bedroom. They were women's voices, and they said words he didn't understand, but he knew they were dreadful words. Then suddenly, crash. Something was upset. He heard people moving about quickly, and there was another crash, and a noise like hitting a mule, only not so bony. Then Linda screamed. "Oh, don't," she said. He ran in. There were 3 women in dark blankets. Linda was on the bed. One of the women was holding her wrists. Another was lying across her legs so that she couldn't kick. The third was hitting her with a whip. Once, twice, 3 times. And each time Linda screamed. Crying, he tugged at the fringe at the woman's blanket. "Please, please." With her free hand, she held him away. The whip came down again, and again Linda screamed. He caught hold of the woman's enormous brown hand between his own and bit it with all his might. She cried out, wrenched her hand free, and gave him a push, such a push that he fell down. While he was lying on the ground, she hit him 3 times with the whip. It hurt more than anything he had ever felt, like fire. The whip whistled again, fell. But this time, it was Linda who screamed. "But why did they want to hurt you, Linda?" he asked that night. He was crying, because the red marks of the whip on his back still hurt so terribly. But he was also crying because people were so beastly and unfair, and because he was only a little boy and couldn't do anything against them. Linda was crying too. She was grown up, but she wasn't big enough to fight against 3 of them. It wasn't fair for her either. "Why did they want to hurt you, Linda?" "I don't know. How should I know?" It was difficult to hear what she said, because she was lying on her stomach and her face was in the pillow. "They say those men are their men," she went on. She did not seem to be talking to him at all. She seemed to be talking with someone inside herself. A long talk, which he didn't understand, and in the end, she started crying louder than ever. "Oh, don't cry, Linda, don't cry." He pressed himself against her. He put his arm around her neck. Linda cried out, "Oh, be careful, my shoulder, oh," and she pushed him away, hard. His head banged against the wall. "Little idiot," she shouted, and then, suddenly, she began to slap him. Slap, slap. "Linda," he cried out. "Oh, Mother, don't." "I'm not your mother. I won't be your mother." But Linda, oh, she slapped him on the cheek. Turned into a savage, she shouted, having young ones like an animal. If it hadn't been for you, I might have gone to the expector. I might have got away, but not with a baby. That would have been too shameful. He saw that she was going to hit him again and lifted his arm to guard his face. Oh, don't, Linda, please don't. Little beast. She pulled down his arm. His face was uncovered. Don't, Linda. He shut his eyes, expecting the blow. But she didn't hit him. After a little time, he opened his eyes again and saw that she was looking at him. He tried to smile at her. Suddenly, she put her arms around him and kissed him again and again. Sometimes, for several days, Linda didn't get up at all. She lay in bed and was sad, or else she drank the stuff that Pope brought and laughed a great deal and went to sleep. Sometimes she was sick. Often she forgot to wash him, and there was nothing to eat except cold tortillas. He remembered the first time she found those little animals in his hair, how she screamed and screamed. The happiest times were when she told him about the other place. And you really can go flying whenever you like, whenever you like. And she would tell him about the lovely music that came out of a box, and all the nice games you could play, and the delicious things to eat and drink, and the light that came when you pressed a little thing in the wall, and the pictures that you could hear and feel and smell as well as see, and another box for making nice smells, and the pink and green and blue and silver house as high as mountains, and everybody happy and no one ever sad or angry, and everyone belonging to everyone else, and the boxes where you could see and hear what was happening at the other side of the world, and babies and lovely clean bottles, everything so clean, and no nasty smells, no dirt at all, and people never lonely, but living together and being so jolly and happy, like the summer dances here in Malpais, but much happier, and the happiness being there every day, every day. He listened by the hour. And sometimes, when he and the other children were tired with too much playing, one of the old men of the pueblo would talk to them in those other words of the great transformer of the world, and of the long fight between right hand and left hand, between wet and dry, of Awona Willona, who made a great fog by thinking in the night, and then made the whole world out of the fog, of Earth Mother and Sky Father, of Ahayuta and Marcelema, the twins of War and Chance, of Jesus and Pukong, of Mary and Etsanatalihi, the woman who makes herself young again, of the black stone at Laguna and the great eagle and Our Lady of Acoma. Strange stories, all the more wonderful to him for being told in the other words and not so fully understood. Lying in bed, he would think of heaven and London and Our Lady of Acoma and the rows and rows of babies in clean bottles, and Jesus flying up, and Linda flying up, and the great director of World Hatcheries in Awanawalona. Lots of men came to see Linda. The boys began to point their fingers at him. In the strange other words, they said that Linda was bad. They called her names he did not understand, but that he knew were bad names. One day they sang a song about her again and again. He threw stones at them. They threw back. A sharp stone cut his cheek. The blood wouldn't stop. He was covered with blood. Linda taught him to read. With a piece of charcoal, she drew pictures on the wall. An animal sitting down, a baby inside a bottle. Then she wrote letters. The cat is on the mat. The tot is in the pot. He learned quickly and easily. When he knew how to read all the words she wrote on the wall, Linda opened her big wooden box and pulled out from under those funny little red trousers she never wore a thin little book. He had often seen it before. When you're bigger, she had said, you can read it. Well, now he was big enough. He was proud. I'm afraid you won't find it very exciting, she said, but it's the only thing I have. She sighed. If only you could see the lovely reading machines that we used to have in London. He began reading The Chemical and Bacteriological Conditioning of the Embryo. Practical Instructions for Beta Embryo Store Workers. It took him a quarter of an hour to read the title alone. He threw the book on the floor. Beastly, beastly book, he said, and began to cry. The boys still sang their horrible song about Linda. Sometimes, too, they laughed at him for being so ragged. When he tore his clothes, Linda did not know how to mend them. In the other place, she told him, people threw away clothes with holes in them and got new ones. Rags, rags, the boys used to shout at him. But I can read, he said to himself, and they can't. They don't even know what reading is. It was fairly easy, if he thought hard enough about the reading, to pretend that he didn't mind when they made fun of him. He asked Linda to give him the book again. The more the boys pointed and sang, the harder he read. Soon he could read all the words quite well, even the longest. But what did that mean? He asked Linda, but even when she could answer, it didn't seem to make it very clear. And generally, she couldn't answer at all. What are chemicals? He would ask. Oh, stuff like magnesium salts and alcohol for keeping the deltas and epsilons small and backward, and calcium carbonate for bones and all that sort of thing. But how do you make chemicals, Linda? Where do they come from? Well, I don't know. You get them out of bottles, and when the bottles are empty, you send up to the chemical store for more. It's the chemical store people who make them, I suppose. Or else they send to the factory for them. I don't know. I never did any chemistry. My job was always with the embryos. It was the same with everything else he asked about. Linda never seemed to know. The old men of the pueblo had much more definite answers. The seed of men and all creatures, the seed of the sun and the seed of the earth, and the seed of the sky, Awona Willona made them all out of the fog of increase. Now the world has 4 wombs, and he laid the seed in the lowest of the 4 wombs, and gradually the seeds began to grow. One day, John calculated later that it must have been soon after his 12th birthday. He came home and found a book that he had never seen before, lying on the floor in the bedroom. It was a thick book and looked very old. The binding had been eaten by mice. Some of its pages were loose and crumpled. He picked it up, looked at the title page. The book was called The Complete Works of William Shakespeare. Linda was lying on the bed, sipping that horrible stinking mezcal out of a cup. Pope brought it, she said. Her voice was thick and hoarse, like somebody else's voice. It was lying in one of the chests of the antelope kiva, supposed to have been there for hundreds of years. I expect it's true, because I looked at it and it seemed to be full of nonsense, uncivilized. Still, it'll be good enough for you to practice your reading on. She took one last sip, set the cup down on the floor beside the bed, turned over on her side, hiccuped once or twice, and went to sleep. He opened the book at random. Nay, but to live, in the rank sweat of an inseamed bed, stewed in corruption, honeying and making love over the nasty sty. The strange words rolled through his mind, rumbled like talking thunder, like the drums at the summer dances, if the drums could have spoken, like the men singing the corn song, beautiful, beautiful, so that you cried, like old Mitsima saying magic over his feathers and his carved sticks and his bits of bone and stone. Kiatla Silu, Siloque, 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 Kie Silu Silu Tsitl. but better than Mitsuma's magic because it meant more, because it talked to him, talked wonderfully and only half understandably. A terrible, beautiful magic about Linda lying there snoring, with the empty cup on the floor beside the bed, about Linda and Pope, Linda and Pope. He hated Pope more and more. A man can smile and be a villain. Remorseless, treacherous, lecherous, kindless villain. What did the words exactly mean? He only half knew. Their magic was strong and went on rumbling in his head, and somehow it was as though he had never really hated Pope before, never really hated him because he had never been able to say how much he hated him. But now he had these words like drums and singing and magic, these words and the strange, strange story out of which they were taken. He couldn't make head or tail of it, but it was wonderful, wonderful all the same. They gave him a reason for hating Pope, and they made his hatred more real. They even made Pope himself more real. One day, when he came in from playing, the door of the inner room was open, and he saw them lying together on the bed, asleep, white Linda, and Pope almost black beside her, with one arm under her shoulders, and the other dark hand on her breast, and one of the plaits of his long hair lying across her throat like a black snake trying to strangle her. Pope's gourd and a cup were standing on the floor near the bed. Linda was snoring. His heart seemed to have disappeared and left a hole. He was empty and cold and rather sick and giddy. He leaned against the wall to steady himself. Remorseless, treacherous, lecherous, like drums, like the men singing for the corn, like magic, the words repeated and repeated themselves in his head. From being cold, he was suddenly hot. His cheeks burnt him with the rush of blood. The room swam and darkened before his eyes. He ground his teeth. "I'll kill him, I'll kill him, I'll kill him," he kept saying. And suddenly there were more words. "When he is drunk asleep or in his rage, or in the incestuous pleasure of his bed." The magic was on his side, and the magic explained and gave orders. He stepped back into the outer room. "When he is drunk asleep." The knife for the meat was lying on the floor near the fireplace. He picked it up and tiptoed to the door again. "When he is drunk asleep, drunk asleep." He ran across the room and stabbed. Oh, the blood! Stabbed again, as Pope heaved out of his sleep, lifted his hand to stab once more, but found his wrist caught, held, and twisted. He couldn't move, he was trapped. And there were Pope's small black eyes, very close, staring into his own. He looked away. There were 2 cuts on Pope's left shoulder. "Oh, look at the blood!" Linda was crying. "Look at the blood!" She had never been able to bear the sight of blood. Pope lifted his other hand to strike him, he thought. He stiffened to receive the blow, but the hand only took him under the chin and turned his face so that he had to look again into Pope's eyes. For a long time, for hours and hours. And suddenly, he couldn't help it. He began to cry. Pope burst out laughing. "Go," he said in the other Indian words. "Go, my brave Ahayuta." He ran out into the other room to hide his tears. "You are 15, said old Mitsima in the Indian words. "Now I may teach you to work the clay." Squatting by the river, they worked together. "First of all," said Mitsima, taking a lump of the wetted clay between his hands, "we make a little moon." The old man squeezed the lump into a disc, then bent up the edges. The moon became a shallow cup. Slowly and unskillfully, he imitated the old man's delicate gestures. "Hi." A moon, a cup, and now a snake. Mitsima rolled out another piece of clay into a long, flexible cylinder, hooped it into a circle, and pressed it on the rim of the cup. then another snake, and another and another. Round by round, Mitsima built up the sides of the pot. It was narrow, it bulged, it narrowed again towards the neck. Mitsima squeezed and patted, stroked and scraped, and there at last it stood and shaped the familiar water pot of Malpais, but creamy white instead of black, and still soft to the touch. The crooked parody of Mitsima's, his own, stood beside it. Looking at the two pots, he had to laugh. "But the next one will be better," he said, and began to moisten another piece of clay. To fashion, to give form, to feel his fingers gaining in skill and power, this gave him an extraordinary pleasure. A, B, C, vitamin D, he sang to himself as he worked. The fat's in the liver, the cod's in the sea. And Mitsima also sang a song about killing a bear. They worked all day, and all day he was filled with an intense, absorbing happiness. "Next winter," said old Mitsima, "I will teach you to make the bow." He stood for a long time outside the house, and at last the ceremonies within were finished. The door opened, they came out. Kothlu came first, his right hand outstretched and tightly closed, as though over some precious jewel. Her clenched hand similarly outstretched. Kiakime followed. They walked in silence, and in silence, behind them, came the brothers and sisters and cousins and all the troop of old people. They walked out of the pueblo, across the mesa. At the edge of the cliff they halted, facing the early morning sun. Kothlu opened his hand. A pinch of cornmeal lay white on the palm. He breathed on it, murmured a few words, then threw it, a handful of white dust, towards the sun. Kiakime did the same. Then Kiakime's father stepped forward and, holding up a feathered prayer stick, made a long prayer, then threw the stick after the cornmeal. "It is finished," said old Mitsima in a loud voice. "They are married." "Well," said Linda as they turned away, "all I can say is, it does seem a lot of fuss to make about so little. In civilized countries, when a boy wants to have a girl, he just... But where are you going, John?" He paid no attention to her calling, but ran on, away, away. Anywhere to be by himself. "It is finished." Old Mitsima's words repeated themselves in his mind. Finished, finished. In silence and from a long way off, but violently, desperately, hopelessly, he had loved Kiakime, and now it was finished. He was 16. At the full moon, in the antelope kiva, secrets would be told, secrets would be done and born. They would go down, boys, into the kiva and come out again men. The boys were all afraid and at the same time impatient. And at last it was the day. The sun went down, the moon rose. He went with the others. Men were standing, dark, at the entrance to the kiva. The ladder went down into the red-lighted depths. Already the leading boys had begun to climb down. Suddenly, one of the men stepped forward, caught him by the arm, and pulled him out of the ranks. He broke free and dodged back into his place among the others. This time the man had struck him, pulled his hair. "Not for you, white hair, not for the son of the she-dog," said one of the other men. The boys laughed. "Go." And he still hovered on the fringes of the group. "Go," the men shouted again. One of them bent down, took a stone, threw it. "Go, go, go!" There was a shower of stones. Bleeding, he ran away into the darkness. From the red-lit kiva came the noise of singing. The last of the boys had climbed down the ladder. He was all alone, outside the pueblo, on the bare plain of the mesa. The rock was like bleached bones in the moonlight. Down in the valley, the coyotes were howling at the moon. The bruises hurt him, the cuts were still bleeding, but it was not for the pain that he sobbed. It was because he was all alone. because he had been driven out, alone, into the skeleton world of rocks and moonlight. At the edge of the precipice he sat down. The moon was behind him. He looked down into the black shadow of the mesa, into the black shadow of death. He had only to take one step, one little jump. He held out his right hand in the moonlight. From the cut on his wrist, the blood was still oozing. Every few seconds a drop fell, dark, almost colorless in the dead light. Drop, drop, drop. Tomorrow, and tomorrow, and tomorrow. He had discovered time, and death, and God. Alone, always alone, the young man was saying. The words awoke a plaintive echo in Bernard's mind. Alone, alone. So am I, he said, on a gush of confidingness. Terribly alone. Are you? John looked surprised. I thought that in the other place. I mean, Linda always said that nobody was ever alone there. Bernard blushed uncomfortably. You see, he said, mumbling and with averted eyes, I'm rather different than most people, I suppose. If one happens to be decanted different. Yes, that's just it. The young man nodded. If one's different, one's bound to be lonely. They're beastly to one. Do you know, they shut me out of absolutely everything. When the other boys were sent out to spend the night on the mountains, you know, when you have to dream which your sacred animal is, they wouldn't let me go with the others. They wouldn't let me tell any of the secrets. I did it by myself, though, he added. Didn't eat anything for 5 days, and then went out one night alone into those mountains there. He pointed. Patronizingly, Bernard smiled. And did you dream of anything? He asked. The other nodded. But I mustn't tell you what. He was silent for a little, then in a low voice. Once, he went on, I did something that none of the others did. I stood against a rock in the middle of the day, in summer, with my arms out, like Jesus on the cross. What on earth for? I wanted to know what it was like being crucified, hanging there in the sun. But why? Why? Well, he hesitated. Because I felt I ought to. If Jesus could stand it. And then, if one has done something wrong. Besides, I was unhappy. That was another reason. It seems a funny way of curing your unhappiness, said Bernard. But on second thoughts, he decided that there was, after all, some sense in it. Better than taking soma. I fainted after a time, said the young man. I fell down on my face. Do you see the mark where I cut myself? He lifted the thick yellow hair from his forehead. The scar showed, pale and puckered, on his right temple. Bernard looked, and then quickly, with a little shudder, averted his eyes. His conditioning had made him not so much pitiful as profoundly squeamish. The mere suggestion of illness or wounds was to him not only horrifying, but even repulsive and rather disgusting, like dirt or deformity or old age. Hastily, he changed the subject. I wonder if you'd like to come back to London with us, he asked, making the first move in a campaign whose strategy he had been secretly elaborating ever since. In the little house, he had realized who the father of this young savage must be. Would you like that? The young man's face lit up. Do you really mean it? Of course. If I can get permission, that is. Linda, too? Well, he hesitated doubtfully. That revolting creature. No, it was impossible. Unless... It suddenly occurred to Bernard that her very revoltingness might prove an enormous asset. But of course, he cried, making up for his first hesitations with an excess of noisy cordiality. The young man drew a deep breath. To think it should be coming true, what I've dreamt of all my life. Do you remember what Miranda says? Who's Miranda? But the young man had evidently not heard the question. Oh, wonder, he was saying, and his eyes shone. His face was brightly flushed. How many goodly creatures are there? How beauteous mankind is. The flush suddenly deepened. He was thinking of Lenina, of an angel in bottle green viscose, lustrous with youth and skin food, plump, benevolently smiling. His voice faltered. Oh, brave new world, he began, then suddenly interrupted himself. The blood had left his cheeks. He was as pale as paper. Are you married to her? He asked. Am I what? Married, forever. They say forever in the Indian words. It can't be broken. For no. Bernard couldn't help laughing. John also laughed, but for another reason. Laughed for pure joy. Oh, brave new world, he repeated. Oh, brave new world that has such people in it. Let's start at once. You have a most peculiar way of talking sometimes, said Bernard, staring at the young man in perplexed astonishment. And anyhow, hadn't you better wait till you actually see the new world? Chapter 9. Lenina felt herself entitled, after this day of queerness and horror, to a complete and absolute holiday. As soon as they got back to the rest house, she swallowed 6 half-gram tablets of soma, lay down on her bed, and within 10 minutes had embarked for lunar eternity. It would be 18 hours at least before she was in time again. Bernard, meanwhile, lay pensive and wide-eyed in the dark. It was long after midnight before he fell asleep. Long after midnight, but his insomnia had not been fruitless. He had a plan. Punctually, on the following morning, at 10 o'clock, the green-uniformed octoroon stepped out of his helicopter. Bernard was waiting for him among the agaves. Miss Crown's gone on Soma holiday, he explained. Can hardly be back before 5, which leaves us 7 hours. He could fly to Santa Fe, do all the business he had to do, and be in Malpe again long before she woke up. She'll be quite safe here by herself. Safe as helicopters, the octoroon assured him. They climbed into the machine and started off at once. At 10:34, they landed on the roof of the Santa Fe post office. At 10:37, Bernard had got through to the World Controller's office in Whitehall. At 10:39, he was speaking to his Fordship's 4th personal secretary. At 10:44, he was repeating his story to the 1st secretary, and at 10:47.5, it was the deep, resonant voice of Mustafa Mond himself that sounded in his ears. I ventured to think, stammered Bernard, that your Fordship might find the matter of sufficient scientific interest. Yes, I do find it of sufficient scientific interest, said the deep voice. Bring these 2 individuals back to London with you. Your Fordship is aware that I shall need special permit. The necessary orders, said Mustafa Mon, are being sent to the warden of the reservation at this moment. You will proceed at once to the warden's office. Good morning, Mr. Marks. There was silence. Bernard hung up the receiver and hurried to the roof. Warden's office, he said to the gamma green octoroon. At 10:54, Bernard was shaking hands with the warden. Delighted, Mr. Marks, delighted. His boom was deferential. We have just received special orders. I know, said Bernard, interrupting him. I was talking to his Fordship on the phone a moment ago. His bored tone implied that he was in the habit of talking to his Fordship every day of the week. He dropped into a chair. If you'll kindly take all the necessary steps as soon as possible, he emphatically repeated. He was thoroughly enjoying himself. At 11:03, he had all the necessary papers in his pocket. So long, he said patronizingly to the warden, who had accompanied him as far as the lift gates. So long. He walked across to the hotel, had a bath, a vibrovac massage, and an electrolytic shave, listened in to the morning's news, looked in for half an hour on the televisor, ate a leisured luncheon, and at 2:30 flew back with the octoroon to Malpais. The young man stood outside the rest house. "Bernard," he called. "Bernard." There was no answer. Noiseless on his deerskin moccasins, he ran up the steps and tried the door. The door was locked. They were gone. Gone. It was the most terrible thing that had ever happened to him. She had asked him to come and see them, and now they were gone. He sat down on the steps and cried. Half an hour later, it occurred to him to look through the window. The first thing he saw was a green suitcase with the initials LC painted on the lid. Joy flared up within him. He picked up a stone. The smashed glass tinkled on the floor. A moment later, he was inside the room. He opened the green suitcase, and all at once he was breathing Lenina's perfume, filling his lungs with her essential being. His heart beat wildly. For a moment, he was almost faint. Then, bending over the precious box, he lifted into the light, he examined. The zippers on Lenina's spare pair of viscose velveteen shorts were at first a puzzle, then solved, a delight. Zip, and then zip, zip, and then zip. He was enchanted. Her green slippers were the most beautiful things he had ever seen. He unfolded a pair of zippy mechanics, blushed, put them hastily away again, but kissed a perfumed acetate handkerchief and wound a scarf round his neck. Opening a box, he split a cloud of scented powder. His hands were floury with the stuff. He wiped them on his chest, on his shoulders, on his bare arms. Delicious perfume. He shut his eyes. He rubbed his cheek against his own powdered arm. Touch of smooth skin against his face, scent in his nostrils of musky dust, her real presence. "Lenina," he whispered. "Lenina." A noise made him start, made him guiltily turn. He crammed up his thieveries into the suitcase and shut the lid, then listened again, looked. Not a sign of life, not a sound. And yet he had certainly heard something like a sigh, something like the crack of a board. He tiptoed to the door and, cautiously opening it, found himself looking on a broad landing. On the opposite side of the landing was another door, ajar. He stepped out, pushed, peeped. There, on a low bed, the sheet flung back, dressed in a pair of pink one-piece zippy pajamas, lay Lenina, fast asleep, and so beautiful in the midst of her curls, so touchingly childish with her pink toes and her grave sleeping face, so trustful in the helplessness of her limp hands and melted limbs, that tears came to his eyes. With an infinity of quite unnecessary precautions, for nothing short of a pistol shot could have called Lenina back from her Somme holiday before the appointed time, he entered the room. He knelt on the floor beside the bed. He gazed, he clasped his hands, his lips moved, he murmured. Her eyes, her hair, her cheek, her gait, her voice. Handless in thy discourse, oh, that her hand, in whose comparison all whites are ink, writing their own reproach, to whose soft seizure the signet's down is harsh. A fly buzzed round her. He waved it away. Flies. He remembered. On the white wonder of dear Juliet's hand may seize, and steal immortal blessing from her lips, who, even in pure and vestal modesty, still blush, as thinking their own kisses sin. Very slowly, with the hesitating gesture of one who reaches forward to stroke a shy and possibly rather dangerous bird, he put it out his hand. It hung there, trembling, within an inch of those limp fingers, on the verge of contact. Did he dare? Dare to profane with his unworthiest hand that... No, he didn't. The bird was too dangerous. His hand dropped back. How beautiful she was. How beautiful. Then suddenly, he found himself reflecting that he had only to take hold of the zipper at her neck and give one long, strong pull. He shut his eyes. He shook his head with the gesture of a dog shaking its ears as it emerges from the water. Detestable thought. He was ashamed of himself. Pure and vestal modesty. There was a humming in the air. Another fly trying to steal immortal blessings? A wasp? He looked, saw nothing. The humming grew louder and louder. Localized itself as being outside the shuttered windows. The plane! In a panic, he scrambled to his feet and ran into the other room, vaulted through the open window, and hurrying along the path between the tall agaves was in time to receive Bernard Marks as he climbed out of the helicopter. Chapter 10. The hands of all the 4,000 electric clocks in all the Bloomsbury Center's 4,000 rooms marked 27 minutes past 2. This hive of industry, as the director was fond of calling it, was in the full buzz of work. Everyone was busy, everything in ordered motion. Under the microscopes, their long tails furiously lashing. Spermatozoa were burrowing headfirst into eggs and fertilized. The eggs were expanding, dividing, or, if Bokanovskified, budding and breaking up into whole populations of separate embryos. From the social predestination room, the escalators went rumbling down into the basement, and there, in the crimson darkness, stewingly warm on their cushion of peritoneum, and gorged with blood surrogate and hormones, the fetuses grew and grew, or, poisoned, languished into a stunted epsilonhood. With a faint hum and rattle, the moving racks crawled imperceptibly through the weeks and the recapitulated aeons to where, in the decanting room, the newly unbottled babes uttered their first yell of horror and amazement. The dynamos purred in the sub-basement. The lifts rushed up and down. On all the 11 floors of nurseries it was feeding time. From 1,800 bottles, 1,800 carefully labeled infants were simultaneously sucking down their pint of pasteurized external secretion. Above them, in 10 successive layers of dormitory, the little boys and girls who were still young enough to need an afternoon sleep were as busy as everyone else, though they did not know it, listening unconsciously to hypnopedic lessons in hygiene and sociability, in class consciousness, and the toddler's love life. Above these again were the playrooms where, the weather having turned to rain, 900 older children were amusing themselves with bricks and clay modeling, hunt the zipper, and erotic play. Buzz, buzz. The hive was humming, busily, joyfully. Blithe was the singing of the young girls over their test tubes. The predestinators whistled as they worked, and in the decanting room, what glorious jokes were cracked above the empty bottles. But the director's face, as he entered the fertilizing room with Henry Foster, was grave, wooden with severity. A public example, he was saying, in this room, because it contains more high-caste workers than any other in the center. I have told him to meet me here at 2:30. He does work very well, put in Henry, with hypocritical generosity. I know, but that's all the more reason for severity. His intellectual eminence carries with it corresponding moral responsibilities. The greater a man's talents, the greater his power to lead astray. It is better that one should suffer than that many should be corrupted. Consider the matter dispassionately, Mr. Foster, and you will see that no offense is so heinous as unorthodoxy of behavior. Murder kills only the individual, and after all, what is an individual? With a sweeping gesture, he indicated the rows of microscopes, the test tubes, the incubators. We can make a new one with the greatest ease, as many as we like. Unorthodoxy threatens more than the life of a mere individual. It strikes at society itself. Yes, at society itself, he repeated. But here he comes. Bernard had entered the room and was advancing between the rows of fertilizers towards them. A veneer of jaunty self-confidence thinly concealed his nervousness. The voice in which he said, "Good morning, Director," was absurdly too loud. That in which, correcting his mistake, he said, "You asked me to come and speak to you here," ridiculously soft, a squeak. "Yes, Mr. Marks," said the director portentously. "I did ask you to come to me here. You returned from your holiday last night, I understand." "Yes," Bernard answered. "Yes," repeated the director, lingering a serpent on the S. Then suddenly raising his voice, "Ladies and gentlemen," he trumpeted, "ladies and gentlemen." The singing of the girls over their test tubes, the preoccupied whistling of the microscopists suddenly ceased. There was a profound silence. Everyone looked around. "Ladies and gentlemen," the director repeated once more, "excuse me for thus interrupting your labors. A painful duty constrains me. The security and stability of society are in danger. Yes, in danger, ladies and gentlemen. This man," he pointed accusingly at Bernard, "this man who stands before you here, this Alpha Plus, to whom so much has been given, and from whom, in consequence, so much must be expected. This colleague of yours, or should I anticipate to say this ex-colleague, has grossly betrayed the trust imposed in him by his heretical views on sport and soma, by the scandalous unorthodoxy of his sex life, by his refusal to obey the teachings of our Ford and behave out of office hours, like a babe in a bottle." Here the director made the sign of the T. "He has proved himself an enemy of society, a subverter, ladies and gentlemen, of all order and stability, a conspirator against civilization itself. For this reason, I propose to dismiss him with ignominy from the post he has held in this center. I propose forthwith to apply for his transference to a sub-center of the lowest order, and that his punishment may serve the best interests of society, as far as possible removed from any important center of population. In Iceland, he will have small opportunity to lead others astray by his unforwardly example." The director paused, then, folding his arms, he turned impressively to Bernard. "Marks," he said, "can you show any reason why I should not now execute the judgment passed upon you?" "Yes, I can," Bernard answered in a very loud voice, somewhat taken aback, but still majestically. "Then show it," said the director. "Certainly, but it's in the passage. One moment." Bernard hurried to the door and threw it open. "Come in," he commanded, and the reason came in and showed itself. There was a gasp, a murmur of astonishment and horror. A young girl screamed. Standing on a chair to get a better view, someone upset 2 test tubes full of spermatozoa, bloated, sagging, and among those firm youthful bodies, those undistorted faces, a strange and terrifying monster of middle-agedness, Linda, advanced into the room, coquettishly smiling her broken and discolored smile, and rolling as she walked, with what was meant to be a voluptuous undulation, her enormous haunches. Bernard walked beside her. "There he is," he said, pointing at the director. "Did you think I didn't recognize him?" Linda asked indignantly, then turning to the director. "Of course I knew you, Tomakin. I should have known you anywhere among 1,000. But perhaps you've forgotten me. Don't you remember? Don't you remember, Tomakin? You're Linda." She stood looking at him, her head on one side, still smiling, but with a smile that became progressively, in face of the director's expression of petrified disgust, less and less self-confident, that wavered and finally went out. "Don't you remember, Tomakin?" she repeated in a voice that trembled. Her eyes were anxious, agonized. The blotched and sagging face twitched grotesquely into the grimace of extreme grief. "Tomakin!" She held out her arms. Someone began to titter. "What's the meaning," began the director, "of this monstrous—" "Tomakin!" She ran forward, her blanket trailing behind her, threw her arms around his neck, hid her face on his chest. A howl of laughter went up irrepressibly. "This monstrous practical joke," the director shouted. Red in the face, he tried to disengage himself from her embrace. Desperately she clung. "But I'm Linda. I'm Linda." The laughter drowned her voice. "You made me have a baby," she screamed above the uproar. There was a sudden and appalling hush. Eyes floated uncomfortably, not knowing where to look. The director went suddenly pale, stopped struggling and stood, his hands on her wrists, staring down at her, horrified. Yes, a baby, and I was its mother. She flung the obscenity like a challenge into the outraged silence. Then, suddenly breaking away from him, ashamed, covered her face with her hands, sobbing. "It wasn't my fault, Tomakin. Because I always did my drill, didn't I? Didn't I? Always. I don't know how. If you knew how awful, Tomakin. But he was a comfort to me all the same." Turning towards the door, "John!" she called. "John!" He came in at once, paused for a moment just inside the door, looked around, then soft on his moccasined feet, strode quickly across the room, fell on his knees in front of the director, and said in a clear voice, "My father!" The word for father was not so much as obscene as, with its connotation of something at one removed from the loathsomeness and moral obliquity of childbearing, merely gross, scatological rather than a pornographic impropriety. The comically smutty word relieved what had become a quite intolerable tension. Laughter broke out, enormous, almost hysterical, peal after peal as though it would never stop. My father, and it was the director. My father? Oh, Ford, that was really too good. The whooping and the roaring renewed themselves. Faces seemed on the point of disintegration. Tears were streaming. 6 more test tubes of spermatozoa were upset. My father! Pale, wild-eyed, the director glared about him in an agony of bewildered humiliation. My father! The laughter, which had shown signs of dying away, broke out again more loudly than ever. He put his hands over his ears and rushed out of the room. Okay. Chapter 11. After the scene in the fertilizing room, all upper-caste London was wild to see this delicious creature who had fallen on his knees before the director of hatcheries and conditioning, or rather the ex-director, for the poor man had resigned immediately afterwards and never set foot inside the center again, had flopped down and called him. The joke was almost too good to be true. My father. Linda, on the contrary, cut no ice. Nobody had the smallest desire to see Linda. To say one was a mother, that was past a joke. It was an obscenity. Moreover, she wasn't a real savage, had been hatched out of a bottle and conditioned like anyone else, so couldn't have really quaint ideas. Finally, and this was by far the strongest reason for people not wanting to see poor Linda, there was her appearance. Fat, having lost her youth, with bad teeth, and a blotched complexion, and that figure forward. You simply couldn't look at her without feeling sick, yes, positively sick. So the best people were quite determined not to see Linda, and Linda, for her part, had no desire to see them. The return to civilization was, for her, the return to Soma, was the possibility of lying in bed and taking holiday after holiday, without ever having to come back to a headache or a fit of vomiting, without ever being made to feel as you always felt after Piotr, as though you'd done something so shamefully antisocial that you could never hold up your head again. Soma played none of these unpleasant tricks. The holiday it gave was perfect, and if the morning after was disagreeable, it was so, not intrinsically, but only by comparison with the joys of the holiday. The remedy was to make the holiday continuous. Greedily she clamored for ever larger, ever more frequent doses. Dr. Shaw at first demurred, then let her have what she wanted. She took as much as 20 grams a day, which will finish her off in a month or two, the doctor confided to Bernard. One day, the respiratory center will be paralyzed. No more breathing. Finished. And a good thing, too. If we could rejuvenate, of course it would be different, but we can't. Surprisingly, as everyone thought, for on Soma holiday, Linda was most conveniently out of the way. John raised objections. But aren't you shortening her life by giving her so much? In one sense, yes, Dr. Shaw admitted, but in another, we're actually lengthening it. The young man stared, uncomprehending. Soma may make you lose a few years in time, the doctor went on, but think of the enormous, immeasurable durations it can give you out of time. Every Soma holiday is a bit of what our ancestors used to call eternity. John began to understand. Eternity was in our lips and eyes, he murmured. Eh? Nothing. Of course, Dr. Shaw went on, you can't allow people to go popping off into eternity if they've got any serious work to do. But, as she hasn't got any serious work, all the same, John persisted, I don't believe it's right. The doctor shrugged his shoulders. Well, of course, if you prefer to have her screaming all the time. In the end, John was forced to give in. Linda got her Soma. Thenceforward, she remained in her little room on the 37th floor of Bernard's apartment house, in bed, with the radio and television always on, and the patchouli tap just dripping, and the Soma tablets within reach of her hand. There she remained, and yet wasn't there at all. Was all the time away, infinitely far away, on holiday in some other world, where the music of the radio was a labyrinth of sonorous colors, a sliding, palpitating labyrinth that led, by what beautifully inevitable windings, to a bright center of absolute conviction, where the dancing images of the television box were the performers in some indescribably delicious, all-singing feelie, where the dripping patchouli was more than a scent, was the sun, was a million saxophones, was Popeye making love, only much more so, incomparably more, and without end. No, we can't rejuvenate, but I'm very glad, Dr. Shaw had concluded, to have had this opportunity to see an example of senility in a human being. Thank you so much for calling me in. He shook Bernard warmly by the hand. It was John, then, they were all after, and as it was only through Bernard, his accredited guardian, that John could be seen, Bernard now found himself, for the first time in his life, treated not merely normally, but as a person of outstanding importance. There was no more talk of the alcohol in his blood surrogate, no gibes at his personal appearance. Henry Foster went out of his way to be friendly. Benito Hoover made him a present of 6 packets of sex hormone chewing gum, and the assistant predestinator came and cadged almost abjectly for an invitation to one of Bernard's evening parties. As for the women, Bernard had only to hint at the possibility of an invitation, and he could have whichever one of them he liked. Bernard's asked me to meet the Savage next Wednesday, Fanny announced triumphantly. I'm so glad, said Lenina. And now you must admit that you were wrong about Bernard. Don't you think he's really rather sweet? Fanny nodded. And I must say, she said, I was quite agreeably surprised. The chief bottler, the director of predestination, 3 deputy assistant fertilizer generals, the professor of Feelies in the College of Emotional Engineering, the dean of Westminster Community Singery, the supervisor of Bokanovskification. The list of Bernard's notabilities was interminable. And I had 6 girls last week, he confided to Helmholtz Watson. 1 on Monday, 2 on Tuesday, 2 more on Friday, and 1 on Saturday. And if I'd had the time or the inclination, there was at least a dozen more who were only too anxious. Helmholtz listened to his boasting in a silence so gloomily disapproving that Bernard was offended. You're envious, he said. Helmholtz shook his head. I'm rather sad, that's all, he answered. Bernard went off in a huff. Never, he told himself, never would he speak to Helmholtz again. The days passed. Success went fizzily to Bernard's head, and in the process completely reconciled him, as any good intoxicant would do, to a world which, up till then, he had found very unsatisfactory. Insofar as it recognized him as important, the order of things was good, but, reconciled by his success, he yet refused to forego the privilege of criticizing this order. For the act of criticizing heightened his sense of importance, made him feel larger. Moreover, he did genuinely believe that there were things to criticize. At the same time, he genuinely liked being a success and having all the girls he wanted. Before those who now, for the sake of the Savage, paid their court to him, Bernard would parade a carping unorthodoxy. He was politely listened to, but behind his back, people shook their heads. That young man will come to a bad end, they said, prophesizing the more confidently in that they themselves would in due course personally see to it that the end was bad. He won't find another Savage to help him out a second time, they said. Meanwhile, however, there was the first Savage. They were polite, and because they were polite, Bernard felt positively gigantic and at the same time light with elation, lighter than air. Lighter than air, said Bernard, pointing upwards. Like a pearl in the sky, high above them, the weather department's captive balloon shone rosily in the sunshine. The said Savage, so ran Bernard's instructions, to be shown civilized life in all its aspects. He was being shown a bird's-eye view of it at present, a bird's-eye view from the platform of the Charing Tea Tower. The station master and the resident meteorologist were acting as guides. But it was Bernard who did most of the talking. Intoxicated, he was behaving as though, at the very least, he were a visiting world controller, lighter than air. The Bombay green rocket dropped out of the sky. The passengers alighted. 8 identical Dravidian twins in khaki looked out the 8 portholes of the cabin, the stewards. 1,250 kilometers an hour, said the station master impressively. What do you think of that, Mr. Savage? John thought it very nice. Still, he said, Ariel could put a girdle around the earth in 40 minutes. The Savage, wrote Bernard in his report to Mustafa Mond, shows surprisingly little astonishment at, or awe of, civilized inventions. This is partly due, no doubt, to the fact that he has heard them talked about by the woman Linda, Mustafa Mond frowned. Does the fool think I'm too squeamish to see the word written out at full length? Partly on his interest being focused on what he calls the soul, which he persists as regarding as an entity independent of the physical environment, whereas, as I tried to point out to him, the controller skipped the next sentences and was just about to turn the page in search of something more interestingly concrete when his eye was caught by a series of quite extraordinary phrases. Though I must admit, he read, that I agree with the Savage in finding civilized infantility too easy or, as he puts it, not expensive enough, and I would like to take this opportunity of drawing your Fordship's attention to... Mustafa Mond's anger gave place almost at once to mirth. The idea of this creature solemnly lecturing him, about the social order was really too grotesque. The man must have gone mad. I ought to give him a lesson, he said to himself, then threw back his head and laughed out loud. For a moment, at any rate, the lesson would not be given. It was a small factory of lighting sets for helicopters, a branch for the Electrical Equipment Corporation. They were met on the roof itself, for that circular letter of recommendation from the controller was magical in its effects, by the chief technician and the human element manager. They walked downstairs into the factory. Each process, explained the human element manager, is carried out, so far as possible, by a single Bokanovsky group, and, in effect, 83 almost noseless black brachycephalic deltas were cold pressing. The 56 4-spindle chucking and turning machines were being manipulated by 56 aquiline and ginger gammas. 107 heat-conditioned epsilon Senegalese were working in the foundry. 33 delta females, long-headed, sandy, with narrow pelvises, and all within 20 millimeters of 1 meter 69 centimeters tall, were cutting screws. In the assembly room, the dynamos were being put together by 2 sets of Gamma Plus dwarfs. The 2 low work tables faced one another. Between them crawled the conveyor with its load of separate parts. 47 blonde heads were confronted by 47 brown ones, 47 snubs by 47 hooks, 47 receding by 47 prognathous chins. The completed mechanisms were inspected by 18 identically curly auburn girls in gamma green, packed in crates by 34 short-legged, left-handed male delta minuses, and loaded into the waiting trucks and lorries by 63 blue-eyed, flaxen, and freckled epsilon semi-morons. Oh, brave new world! By some malice of his memory, the Savage found himself repeating Miranda's words. Oh, brave new world that has such people in it. And I assure you, the human element manager concluded, as they left the factory, we hardly ever have any trouble with our workers. We always find But the savage had suddenly broken away from his companions and was violently retching behind a clump of laurels, as though the solid earth had been a helicopter in an air pocket. The savage, wrote Bernard, refuses to take Soma. It seems much distressed because the woman Linda, remains permanently on holiday. It is worthy of note that, in spite of his mother's censored senility and the extreme repulsiveness of her appearance, the savage frequently goes to see her and appears to be much attached to her. An interesting example of the way in which early conditioning can be made to modify and even run counter to natural impulses. In this case, the impulse to recoil from such an unpleasant object. At Eton, they alighted on the roof of upper school. On the opposite side of schoolyard, the 52 stories of Lupton's Tower gleamed white in the sunshine. College on their left, and on their right, the school community singery reared their venerable piles of ferro-concrete and vita-glass. In the center of the quadrangle stood the quaint old chrome steel statue of our Ford. Dr. Gaffney, the provost, and Miss Keat, the headmistress, received them as they stepped out of the plane. "Do you have many twins here?" the savage asked rather apprehensively as they set out on their tour of inspection. "Oh no," the provost answered. "Eton is reserved exclusively for upper caste boys and girls. 1 egg, 1 adult. It makes education more difficult, of course, but as they'll be called upon to take responsibilities and deal with unexpected emergencies, it can't be helped," he sighed. Bernard, meanwhile, had taken a strong fancy to Miss Keat. "If you're free any Monday, Wednesday, or Friday evening," he was saying, jerking his thumb towards the savage. "He's curious, you know," Bernard added. "Quaint." Miss Keat smiled, and her smile was really charming, he thought. Said thank you, would be delighted to come into one of his parties. The provost opened the door. 5 minutes in that Alpha Double Plus classroom left John a trifle bewildered. "What is elementary relativity?" he whispered to Bernard. Bernard tried to explain, then thought better of it and suggested that they go to some other classroom. From behind a door in the corridor leading to the Beta Minus geography room, a ringing soprano voice called, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then with a weary impatience, "As you were." "Malthusian drill," explained the headmistress. "Most of our girls are free martins, of course. I'm a free martin myself." She smiled at Bernard. "But we have about 800 unsterilized ones who need constant drilling." In the Beta Minus geography room, John learned that a savage reservation is a place which, owing to unfavorable climatic or geological conditions or poverty of natural resources, has not been worth the expense of civilizing. A click. The room was darkened, and suddenly, on the screen above the master's head, there were the penitentes of Acma prostrating themselves before Our Lady, and wailing as John had heard them wail, confessing their sins before Jesus on the cross, before the eagle image of Pukong. The young Etonians fairly shouted with laughter. Still wailing, the penitentes rose to their feet, stripped off their undergarments, and, with knotted whips, began to beat themselves, blow after blow. Redoubled, the laughter drowned even the amplified record of their groans. "But why do they laugh?" asked the savage in a pained bewilderment. "Why?" The provost turned towards him in a still broadly grinning face. "Why? But because it's so extraordinarily funny." In the cinematographic twilight, Bernard risked a gesture which, in the past, even total darkness would have hardly emboldened him to make. Strong in his new importance, He put his arm round the headmistress's waist. It yielded willingly. He was just about to snatch a kiss or two, and perhaps a gentle pinch, when the shutters opened again. "Perhaps we had better go on," said Miss Keat, and moved towards the door. "And this," said the provost a moment later, "is the hypnopathic control room. Hundreds of synthetic music boxes, one for each dormitory, stood arranged in shelves round 3 sides of the room. Pigeonholed on the fourth were the paper soundtrack rolls on which the various hypnopathic lessons were printed. "You slip the roll in there," explained Bernard, interrupting Dr. Gaffney. "Press down this switch." "Not that one," corrected the provost, annoyed. "That one, then." The roll unwinds. The selenium cells transform the light impulses into sound waves, and there you are, Dr. Gaffney concluded. "Do they read Shakespeare?" asked the savage as they walked, on their way to biochemical laboratories, past the school library. "Certainly not," said the headmistress, blushing. "Our library," said Dr. Gaffney, "contains only books of reference. If our young people need distraction, they can get it at the Feelies. We don't encourage them to indulge in any solitary amusements." 5 busloads of boys and girls, singing or in a silent embracement, rolled past them over the vitrified highway. "Just returned," explained Dr. Gaffney, while Bernard, whispering, made an appointment with the headmistress for that very evening. From the slow crematorium, death conditioning begins at 18 months. Every tot spends 2 mornings a week in a hospital for the dying. All the best toys are kept there, and they get chocolate cream on death days. They learn to take dying as a matter of course. Like any other physiological process, put in the headmistress professionally. 8 o'clock at the Savoy. It was all arranged. On their way back to London, they stopped at the Television Corporation's factory at Brentford. "Do you mind waiting here a moment while I go and telephone?" asked Bernard. The savage waited and watched. The main day shift was just going off duty. Crowds of lower caste workers were queued up in front of the monorail station. 700 or 800 Gamma, Delta, and Epsilon men and women, with not more than a dozen faces and statures between them. To each of them, with his or her ticket, the booking clerk pushed over a little cardboard pillbox. The long caterpillar of men and women moved slowly forward. "What's in those?" Remembering the Merchant of Venice. "Those caskets," the savage inquired when Bernard had rejoined them. "The day's soma ration," Bernard answered, rather indistinctly, for he was masticating a piece of Benito Hoover's chewing gum. "They get it after their work's over. 4 half-gram tablets, 6 on Saturdays." He took John's arm affectionately, and they walked back towards the helicopter. Lenina came singing into the changing room. "You seem very pleased with yourself," said Fanny. "I am pleased," she answered. Zip! Bernard rang up half an hour ago. Zip, zip! She stepped out of her shorts. "He has an unexpected engagement." Zip! "Asked me if I'd take the savage to the Feelies this evening. I must fly." She hurried away towards the bathroom. "She's a lucky girl," Fanny said to herself as she watched Lenina go. There was no envy in the comment. Good-natured Fanny was merely stating a fact. Lenina was lucky. Lucky in having shared with Bernard a generous portion of the savage's immense celebrity. Lucky in reflecting from her insignificant person the moment's supremely fashionable glory. Had not the secretary of the Young Women's Fortean Association asked to give her to a lecture about her experiences? Had she not been invited to the annual dinner of the Aphrodisium Club? Had she not already appeared in the Feuilleton News, visibly, audibly, and tactually appeared to countless millions all over the planet? Hardly less flattering had been the attentions paid her by conspicuous individuals. The resident world controller's second secretary had asked her to dinner and breakfast. She had spent one weekend with the Ford Chief Justice and another with the arch community songster of Canterbury. The president of the Internal and External Secretions Corporation was perpetually on the phone, and she had been to Deauville with the deputy governor of the Bank of Europe. It's wonderful, of course, and yet, in a way, she had confessed to Fanny, I feel as though I were getting something on false pretenses, because, of course, the first thing they all want to know is what it's like to make love to a savage. And I have to say, I don't know. She shook her head. Most of the men don't believe me, of course, but it's true. I wish it weren't, she added sadly and sighed. He's terribly good looking, don't you think so? But doesn't he like you? Asked Fanny. Sometimes I think he does, and sometimes I think he doesn't. He always does his best to avoid me, goes out of the room when I come in, won't touch me, won't even look at me. But sometimes if I turn around suddenly, I catch him staring, and then, well, you know how men look when they like you. Yes, Fanny knew. I can't make it out, said Lenina. She couldn't make it out, and not only was bewildered, was also rather upset. Because you see, Fanny, I like him. Liked him more and more. Well, now there's a real chance, she thought, as she scented herself after her bath. Dab, 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 a real chance. Her spirits overflowed in song. Hug me till you drug me, honey. Kiss me till I'm in a coma. Hug me, honey, snugly, bunny. Love's as good as Soma. The scent organ was playing a delightfully refreshing herbal capriccio, rippling arpeggios of thyme and lavender, of rosemary, basil, myrtle, tarragon, a series of daring modulations through the spice keys into ambergris, and a slow return through sandalwood, camphor, cedar, and new mown hay, with occasional subtle touches of discord. A whiff of kidney pudding, the faintest suspicion of pig's dung. Back to the simple aromatics with which the piece began. The final blast of time died away. There was a round of applause. The lights went up. In the synthetic music machine, the soundtrack roll began to unwind. It was a trio for hyperviolin, supercello, and oboe surrogate that now filled the air with its agreeable languor. 30 or 40 bars, and then, against this instrumental background, a much more than human voice began to warble. Now throaty, now from the head, now hollow as a flute, now charged with yearning harmonics, it effortlessly passed from the Gaspard Forster's low record on the very frontiers of musical tone to a thrilled bat note high above the highest C, to which, in 1770, at the Ducal Opera of Parma, and to the astonishment of Mozart, Lucrezia Agiugari, alone of all the singers in history, once piercingly gave utterance. Snuck in the pneumatic stalls, Lenina and the savage sniffed and listened. It was now the turn also for eyes and skin. The house lights went down. Fiery letters stood out and solid and as though self-supported in the darkness. 3 weeks in a helicopter, an all-super-singing, synthetic, talking, colored, stereoscopic feely, with synchronized scent organ accompaniment. Take hold of those metal knobs on the arms of your chair, whispered Lenina. Otherwise, you won't get any of the feely effects. The savage did as he was told. Those fiery letters, meanwhile, had disappeared. There were 10 seconds of complete darkness. Then suddenly, dazzling and incomparably more solid-looking than they would have seemed in actual flesh and blood, far more real than reality, there stood the stereoscopic images, locked in one another's arms, of a gigantic Negro and golden-haired young brachycephalic beta plus female. The savage started. that sensation on his lips. He lifted a hand to his mouth. The titillation ceased. Let his hand fall back on the metal knob. It began again. The scent organ, meanwhile, breathed pure musk. Expiringly, a soundtrack super dove cooed. Ooh. And vibrating only 32 times a second, a deeper than African bass made answer. Ah. Ooh. Ooh ah. The stereoscopic lips came together again, and once more the facial erogenous zones of the 6,000 spectators in the Alhambra tingled with almost intolerable galvanic pleasure. Ooh. The plot of the film was extremely simple. A few minutes after the first oohs and ahs, a duet having been sung, and a little love made on that famous bearskin, every hair of which, the assistant predestinator, was perfectly right, could be separately and distinctly felt. The Negro had a helicopter accident, fell on his head, thump, what a twinge through the forehead. A chorus of ows and ayes went up from the audience. The concussion knocked all the Negro's conditioning into a cocked hat. He developed for the beta blonde an exclusive and maniacal passion. She protested. He persisted. There were struggles, pursuits, an assault on a rival, finally a sensational kidnapping. The beta blonde was ravished away into the sky and kept there, hovering, for 3 weeks in a wildly antisocial tete-a-tete with the black madman. Finally, after a whole series of adventures and much aerial acrobacy, 3 handsome young alphas succeeded in rescuing her. The Negro was packed off to an adult reconditioning center, and the film ended happily and decorously, with the beta blonde becoming the mistress of all 3 of her rescuers. They interrupted themselves for a moment to sing a synthetic quartet with full super orchestral accompaniment and gardenias and the scent organ. Then the bearskin made a final appearance, and, amid a blare of saxophones, the last stereoscopic kiss faded into darkness, and the last electric titillation died on the lips like a dying moth that quivers, ever more feebly, ever more faintly, and at last is quiet, quite still. But for Lenina, the moth did not completely die. Even after the lights had gone up, while they were shuffling slowly along with the crowd towards the lifts, its ghost still fluttered against her lips, still traced fine shuddering roads of anxiety and pleasure across her skin. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes dually bright, her breath came deeply. She caught hold of the savage's arm and pressed it, limp, against her side. He looked down at her for a moment, pale, pained, desiring, and ashamed of his desire. He was not worthy, not. Their eyes for a moment met. What treasures hers promised? A queen's ransom of temperament? Hastily he looked away, disengaged his imprisoned arm. He was obscurely terrified lest she should cease to be something he could feel himself unworthy of. "I don't think you ought to see things like that," he said, making haste to transfer from Lenina herself to the surrounding circumstances the blame for any past or possible future lapse from perfection. "Things like what, John?" "Like this horrible film." "Horrible?" Lenina was genuinely astonished. "But I thought it was lovely." "It was base," he said indignantly. "It was ignoble." She shook her head. "I don't know what you mean. Why was he so queer? Why did he go out of his way to spoil things?" In the taxicopter, he hardly even looked at her. Bound by strong vows that had never been pronounced, obedient to laws that had long since ceased to run, he sat averted and in silence, sometimes, as though a finger had plucked at some taut, almost breaking string, his whole body would shake with a sudden nervous start. The taxicopter landed on the roof of Lenina's apartment house. At last, she thought exultantly as she stepped out of the cab. At last, even though he had been so queer just now. Standing under a lamp, she peered into her hand mirror. At last. Yes, her nose was a bit shiny. She shook the loose powder from her puff. While he was paying off the taxi, there would just be time. She rubbed at the shininess, thinking, he's terribly good looking. No need for him to be shy like Bernard. And yet, any other man would have done it long ago. Well, now, at last. That fragment of a face in the little round mirror suddenly smiled at her. "Good night," said a strangled voice behind her. Lennon wheeled around. He was standing in the doorway of the cab, his eyes fixed, staring. Had evidently been staring all this time while she was powdering her nose, waiting, but what for? Or hesitating, trying to make up his mind, and all the time thinking. She could not imagine what extraordinary thoughts. "Good night, Lenina," he repeated, and made a strange grimacing attempt to smile. "But John, I thought you were... aren't you?" He shut the door and bent forward to say something to the driver. The cab shot up in the air. Looking down through the window in the floor, the savage could see Lenina's upturned face, pale in the bluish light of the lamps. The mouth was open. She was calling. Her foreshortened figure rushed away from him. The diminishing square of the roof seemed to be falling through the darkness. 5 minutes later, he was back in his room. From its hiding place, he took out his mouse-nibbled volume, turned with a religious care its stained and crumpled pages, and began to read Othello. Othello, he remembered, was like the hero of 3 Weeks in a Helicopter, a black man. Drying her eyes, Lenina walked across the roof to the lift. On her way down to the 27th floor, she pulled out her Soma bottle. 1 gram, she decided, would not be enough. Hers had been more than a 1-gram affliction. But if she took 2 grams, she ran the risk of not waking up in time tomorrow morning. She compromised and, into her cupped left palm, shook out 3 half-gram tablets. And that's the end of chapter 11. And I'm gonna stop here. But it was an interesting chapter. We got a lot of world building. We got the super dramatic scene with Bernard almost getting sent to Iceland, but pulling out his secret weapon, Linda and the savage. That was dramatic. And then we got I enjoy watching Linda and her fascination with John. John's savage, right? And John just seems so great. I'm happy that they brought him back, and I'm happy that we got the title through John. He's coming to this brave new world, and I'm still loving that we're meshing these two completely different backgrounds together, because it's a good way to exhibit the overarching points in the story, I think. So not much else to say as far as the social commentary. I think it's pretty similar to the themes that we've been exploring thus far. But I'm going to think on it, because I always miss stuff, honestly. But I just wanted to say thanks for hanging out. Thanks for the hello, Vrillix. And as always, thanks, Portable Jeff. Appreciate your presence. And yeah, we'll finish this up. I don't know when we're going to finish this. We're on chapter 12, and this is already part 4, so I'm assuming it's many more parts, but hopefully it's been enjoyable, and See you next time, probably next week. The schedule that I've posted is correct, so if you're going by that, then that's still accurate until further notice, but I'll let you know if anything changes. So, thank you for spending time with me. Hope it was interesting or relaxing. And yeah, I'll see you next time. So, good night or have a good day. And tune in next time or to the VOD when this gets posted. So, bye. Thanks.